Hey guys, tonight we're standing at the banks of the Nile, water shimmering under moonlight, papyrus reeds swaying lazily in the breeze, and the faint hum of crickets making the shoreline feel like one great lullaby. You can almost sense the heat of the day passing out of the sand, leaving behind that slow warmth that clings like a leftover blanket. This is where the story begins, in those liminal hours between daylight labor and nighttime stillness, when ancient Egyptians found themselves with nothing but time, imagination, and the eternal flow of the river to keep them company. Sure, you could spend every hour farming, carving, or hauling blocks the size of SUVs. But even here, thousands of years ago, humans dreamed up ways to play. And play, well, it might just be one of our species' most universal survival tactics, even when you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in their sunburned sandals. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? It's one of my favorite rituals, seeing all the corners of the world gathered here in this sleepy little circle. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start with the Nile at your feet, literally the bloodstream of Egypt. It's dawn now, and as you blink against the pale light, the world begins to flicker into motion. Fishermen tug nets from the water, their calloused hands dripping with Nile perch and catfish that will feed the village for the day. Oxen smell faintly of dust and sweat, pulling plows across newly silted fields. The air still feels heavy with last night's heat, but the promise of bread and beer, yes, even beer for breakfast, nudges people into their routines. Everyone has their task, from children herding geese to teenagers pounding grain into flour. Even, you have to admit, the whole wake up with the sun and work till it sets lifestyle feels demanding. You're tired just watching them balance pitchers of water on their heads while strolling across sand as if it were polished stone. Which makes you think, when exactly do these people relax? And what, in a world without Netflix, crossword puzzles, or doom scrolling on your phone at midnight, do they do for fun? Here's the thing. Archaeologists have uncovered plenty of proof that ancient Egyptians knew how to play. Well, their version of play. They channeled that leftover energy into games. Some improvised with pebbles, others carved into ornate stone boards. The truth is, when the sun dipped down and torches flickered in clay sconces, Egyptians craved diversion as much as you do when pretending you'll read that book by your bed instead of binging an entire season of a show. You step through a village, hearing chatter rise over the hiss of bread baking on flat stones. A group of kids squats in the dust, flicking little sticks like makeshift dice. They laugh, squabble, and argue over whose turn actually counts, because apparently arguing about the rules transcends all cultures and eras. Historians know they played versions of knucklebones, cowrie-shell tossing, and even rhythm-based games that doubled as ways to practice hand-eye coordination for future fieldwork. It wasn't just leisure. It was training wrapped in fun. The fascinating part? Historians still argue whether structured board games emerged from this kind of child's play, or whether religious rituals dripped down into daily life and crystallized into casual gaming. Was it the kids in the dirt or the priests in the temples who birthed the earliest game of Senate? Honestly, we may never find out. What you do see, though, is the overlap. Games weren't just entertainment. They were threads tying family, society, and even spiritual beliefs together. As the morning brightens, sunlight glints off something tucked under a villager's mat. A crude wooden grid scratched with faint lines in uneven squares. You crouch, feeling the notches etched with care. It's no smartphone, but it is a prototype, a place where tokens once slid across a board in quiet competition. Maybe it's the weight of survival here, where disease, famine, and flocks of crocodiles really cut into life expectancy, that pushes people toward ritualized distraction. A game isn't just fun. It slows the world for a while. By noon, the heat scorches everything. Workers slump in patches of shade, the smell of lentil stew drifting down dusty lanes. And there it is again. A cluster of young men drawing patterns directly into the dirt, dropping pebbles into squares, sliding them just beyond one another's reach. You lean in, watching, realizing this is where history's games live. Not in grand palaces, but in these sun-baked villages where every precious spare minute turns into play. Egyptian culture had this balance, right? Endless devotion to gods, pharaohs, and the afterlife, sure, but they kept this undercurrent of lightness. They carved jokes into graffiti on temple walls. They left behind carved toys like little hippos with wheels. They even buried models of boats, pets, and yes, board games with their dead. Because imagine this, even in eternity, trapped between the stars and Osiris' judgment, you still might need a way to kill time. It's funny. Modern historians spend lifetimes trying to decode the rules of these games, yet an Egyptian 7-year-old with sticky fingers probably mastered one by breakfast, argued about it by lunch, and abandoned it for a game of chase before sundown. It reminds you that history, for all its grandeur, is ultimately just people finding ways to keep themselves amused. The Nile continues to move beside you, constant and unbothered. Crocodiles drift lazily along the banks, their jaws conveniently closed, as if even they've decided to take part in the afternoon nap. This whole world feels drowsy, content, and timeless. And as you sink further into the calm, you realize something. Out of the rhythm of this land, where survival is as constant as the river itself, humans could still invent something as small, and yet as eternal as a game carved into wood. The sun is higher now, pressing down with that relentless Egyptian brightness, the kind that makes the sand shimmer as if the whole desert might melt into a lake. You trudge further away from the river's blessing and into the heart of a village, noticing the rhythm of daily routines filling every corner like music. Mud huts squat under woven reed roofs, goats bleat disapprovingly at nothing in particular, and the scent of baking barley bread hangs as thick as the heat. This is where you see life at its simplest, grinding flour, weaving baskets, stirring stews, and yet, flickers of imagination already hide between these chores. After all, leisure doesn't come first. It slips in quietly through cracks left by survival. Picture yourself kneeling down by a woman who's expertly weaving a wide reed basket. Her hands move so quickly, so automatically, that you wonder if her mind is running elsewhere. Maybe she's half dreaming about an upcoming festival. Maybe she's just thinking about whether her son will finally stop losing at knucklebones. Because here's the first mainstream fact of this section. While life was dominated by work, the Egyptians did no downtime. Archaeologists found gaming boards stashed in ordinary homes. Some scratched from plaster, others drawn right into rooftops. For a people so tied to the calendar of Nile floods and chores, sneaking time for play was almost rebellious. As you move through alleys, you spot boys rolling animal bones like dice. Yes, literal knuckle bones, dried and polished from goats or sheep. They laugh at their luck, slapping thighs and shouting as if the gods personally care whether a bone lands this way or that. And in a way, perhaps the gods did. Entertainment wasn't neatly split from spirituality here. A lazy throw might be a casual omen, depending on who was interpreting it. Historians still argue whether Egyptians treated everyday games as harmless fun or as small moments where divine whispers slipped through. Were those bones really just primitive dice, or were they quietly prophetic tools? That's the academic tug-of-war, and it only makes the idea of playtime that much more fascinating. Meanwhile, mothers push open shutters, calling kids back home to carry water or collect dung fuel. You can almost hear the sighs of little ones forced to abandon the best round ever. Playtime wasn't endless. Responsibility always loomed. Yet, you see cracks in the monotony everywhere. A young girl smooths out mud, scratching lines into the surface with a reed stalk. Your first little glimpse of what could turn into a board pattern. She's not instructed by a priest. She's not observing religious protocol. She's simply improvising lines because her mind sees shapes where life demands efficiency. That's how invention sparks. Not necessarily in golden palaces, but in ordinary laps where the only tools are imagination and muddy fingers. The truth is, Egyptians knew life could be monotonous. Herding geese isn't fun unless you find ways to make it fun. Like racing your friend to the riverbank, or betting which goose will be slowest to waddle into line. So you imagine the seeds of board games sowed like that. Simple competitions tucked within chores, eventually crystallizing into something more structured, more lasting. Here comes the quirky tidbit. Did you know some Egyptologists have argued, half seriously, that even laundry folded into game prototypes? Workers scraping and folding linen sometimes practiced little toss-and-catch contests, essentially turning boring laundry into proto-ball games. People will always transform work into play when given half a chance. It's the same instinct that makes you stack tea bags into a mini pyramid at your office, or spend 3 minutes trying to toss crumpled notes into a bin. But remember, this is also a society choking on ritual. Every sunrise was dedicated to RA. Every crop counted as Horus' blessing. So even when play seemed like mere passing of time, religion hovered close. Imagine rolling bones, tossing sticks, or sliding tokens and whispering, "May Batet grant me luck." This wasn't Vegas, there were no jackpots, but there was a sense that a good throw might win subtle divine approval. The fascinating part here isn't just the invention of objects, but the sneaky way play invaded daily rhythm. Work and play weren't opposites. They overlapped. A potter might idly press circles into the rim of his clay while it hardened, almost doodling the first board design. A farmer resting beneath a palm might set pebbles in the sand just so, sliding them with his thumb. Perhaps years later, someone said, "Wait, what if we do this every evening? Same rules, real tokens?" Then suddenly, something like Senet or Mehen feels possible. As the afternoon creeps in, sounds of pounding barley, chopping vegetables, and animals gnawing stalks meld into the background hum, and you realize the rhythm itself is hypnotic. The villagers' lives proceed in repetition so steady it's practically a drumbeat. And yet out of this monotony, sparks fly. Measured leisure, tiny contests, playful improvisations. The seed of a game board is born in stolen slivers of time, couched between grindstones and woven mats. It's ordinary, but inside the ordinary lies the extraordinary. The start of invention that centuries later will rest in museum glass cases, marveled at under bright, sterile lights. So as you sink back under the shade of a mud hut and watch smoke curl gently into the sky, you begin to sense it. Gaming in Egypt was never wasted time. It was a way of carving joy into the endless workday, a rebellion against sand, sweat, and repetition. A little laugh here, a token there, and suddenly ordinary villagers are the unwitting ancestors of the very board games stacked in your own closet today. By now, the sun is a molten coin hanging high above the Nile, and the workers squint at it almost suspiciously, as if it has personally betrayed them by being so hot. You wander away from the dusty hum of laundry, weaving, and grinding to somewhere quieter, yet somehow heavier. Stone statues rise around you, temple walls tower over wandering villagers, and the smell of incense replaces the earthy aroma of barley and bread. Here, leisure no longer hides in shadows. It intertwines with ritual, prayer, and the weight of gods. And here you discover another facet of ancient Egyptian play. The game table is not just for fun, it's for fate. Inside the temple courtyard, you notice carvings. People hunched over grids of squares, their hands hovering over carved tokens. This isn't a tavern scene. It's sacred art tied directly to eternity. Welcome to the strange marriage between religion and entertainment. The Egyptians' most famous board game, Senet, wasn't only played under cool evening palms. It was imagined as stairways, guides, and borderlines between mortality and immortality. The Egyptians somehow managed to make their version of game night into the spiritual rehearsal of the afterlife. Mainstream fact for today: Senet boards were buried with the dead. Archaeologists have found elaborate, gilded examples tucked neatly into tombs ranging from nobles to pharaohs. It's almost like being buried with your Nintendo Switch. Except this one allegedly helped your soul navigate the Duat, the Egyptian realm beyond death. Now, this is where things get curious. Historians still argue whether Senet originally started as just a fun pastime and only later absorbed religious overtones, or whether it was always intended as a mystical pathway game. Imagine playing chess purely for fun, until suddenly, centuries later, someone insists that every night move decides if you'll be allowed into heaven. That's the scale of rebranding Senet experienced. In your mind's eye, you crouch by a priest. His robe whispers across sandstone as he flicks a carved piece across the board. He mutters under his breath, maybe prayers, maybe curses, and you wonder if the gods leaned over too, watching the outcome of a particularly close round. After all, Egyptians believed life itself was a game of passage. You enter the board at birth, you struggle past setbacks, and if fortunate, you exit properly to the great beyond. A misplayed game wasn't just embarrassing. In some interpretations, it symbolized losing favor with Marat, goddess of balance and truth. Quirky tidbit. Some surviving Senate boards are reversible. They had another game etched onto the back. Imagine carrying your favorite game board, flipping it over when bored of one mode. It's the world's earliest 2-in-1 entertainment package. You don't get DLC here, you just get the flip side. Meanwhile, everyday villagers in their huts might not have thought so dramatically. For them, Senate was a way to pass hot nights, gossiping and teasing while the stars pricked into being overhead. Yet here, framed by temples and hieroglyphs, the same game transforms into sacred practice. The rules? Still hazy even now. Archaeologists guess at dice rolls or stick tosses moving pawns forward, but details are lost. Debate lingers, like an unresolved family feud over official Monopoly rules. Did you block opponents? Skip spaces? Was there a penalty for landing on certain squares? We might never know exactly, and the not knowing is part of the charm. So why does this sacred spin matter? Because in Egypt you rarely got to separate leisure from belief. A farmer could sit down to play Senate and suddenly find himself reenacting a myth where RA journeys through darkness. A child chasing knucklebones might be echoing ancient divinations disguised as fun. A token sliding forward didn't just beat your opponent. It rehearsed how your soul might one day beat the odds of judgment. Picture it. The torches flicker. A priest and a scribe bend over the board, their shadows exaggerated on sandstone walls depicting jackal-headed gods. Their voices drop low, their breath thick with incense. To you, it looks like two grown men just arguing about whether the dice counted. But to them, it's more. Laughter and strategy blend with reverence, as the moves could echo a script of eternity, whispered in the tongue of gods. What's soothing here is the timeless familiarity. Even under divine weight, humans still argued about unfair roles, probably invented excuses, maybe even pouted when losing. Imagine Osiris frowning slightly as one priest mutters, "That wasn't supposed to count." Suddenly, this grand cosmic rehearsal becomes very human again. By evening's edge, as shadows stretch long and night breezes carry both the scent of dates and incense, you recline against a cool temple pillar. The chants ripple across the air while a few players remain gathered in the corner, still adjusting pawns, still debating luck and destiny. And you realize Egyptian life revolved around gods not only at altars but also around these playing boards. A game could be both laughter over a beer jar and a delicate preparation for eternity. Imagine sitting at your family board game night and also thinking, "This round might just save my soul." That's Egypt for you. The temple walls fade into darkness behind you, and as you meander back into the streets, the smell of hot earth mingles with roasting onions and garlicky stews. The day is near its peak, and the people are moving sluggishly, trying to wrestle something soothing out of unbearable heat. In that drowsy lull, you stumble into the workshop of a craftsman, someone whose quiet labor just might give birth to the very first tools of play. Inside, the air smells of wood shavings and damp clay. The floor is littered with half-finished jars and crude furniture, the kind that disappears with everyday decay and leaves only shards for archaeologists. In one corner, though, you spot something slightly different. Flat planks with etched lines, waiting, perhaps, to serve as boards. The craftsman, sweaty and focused, runs his reed stylus across the soft surface, gouging shapes into it with the same rhythm he uses to decorate pots. Only here, the result is not storage vessels. It's grids, squares, and pathways for tokens. Tokens themselves are another experiment. Cut pieces of carved limestone, scraps of bone polished into discs, or even leftover pebbles from the riverbed. Improvisation fuels invention. Mainstream fact here. Archaeologists have found Senate boards carved into everything from luxurious ivory and stone to the backs of workmanlike wooden slabs. Not every Egyptian had gilded luxury. Sometimes play lived in the very tools of survival. Even ordinary clay could become a stage for the slow shuffle of pawns. And here's the quirky element. Sometimes Egyptians turned household items into tokens. For instance, little sherds of pottery were repurposed for pawns. Imagine using your broken favorite mug to become a game piece. Suddenly, your clumsiness turns into entertainment. There's something reassuring about that timeless thrift. You crouch near the craftsman, listening to the scrape of reed-on wood while flies buzz lazily in the hot air. It's so simple, this act, scratching lines into a surface, but every culture's games started with some version of it. Chessboards, backgammon grills, even tic-tac-toe owe their ancestors the same scribbles. The Egyptians, though, gave this act gravitas. A scratched grid wasn't only for fun. It became a cosmic mirror, a way to frame human fate with manageable boundaries. It makes you notice how children sometimes mimic parents. Nearby, a little boy plays with leftover scraps of clay, pressing fingerprints into them as if making tiny discs. Each one is irregular, lopsided, and absolutely perfect for a quick after-dinner match. His mother doesn't fuss. She laughs, probably recognizing the pattern. This is leisure disguised as play, experimenting with tokens while life insists on labor. Of course, historians still argue about how those very tokens were used on different games. Some boards appear to match Senet, others reflect Mehen, the spiral board game shaped like a coiled serpent. Were the pawns aligned differently here? Did some games fade into obscurity the way half of modern apps vanish within a year? Scholars debate fiercely, reconstructing possible rules that remain stubbornly incomplete, which, honestly, might suit the sleepy narrator in you. Sometimes it's nice not to know every step, but just to imagine pieces sliding, dice rattling, laughter rising. You notice women in another part of the workshop rolling small clay sticks, drying them in the sun. These aren't for weaving or sewing, they're makeshift dice alternatives, marked with simple notches to determine outcomes. Imagine slapping 3 of those on the board. Their clatter surprisingly like modern D6 dice. Even in 2000 BCE, human beings still loved the tension of luck. There's humor in this too. You picture the craftsman proudly presenting his new game pieces to the village, only to be told the paint rubs off too quickly, or the dice are cursed because they keep favoring anti-Hatshepsut. Humans have been bad losers forever. You can almost hear, "These tokens are rigged," echoing over the ages. The heat fades slowly toward amber evening light. The craftsman smooths the last etching, blowing shavings aside. He sets the new board against the wall, where it will probably find its way into the home of either a wealthy merchant or a priest looking for an educational distraction. And just like that, through clay scraps, wood etches, and improvised dice, board games creep from offhand village pastime into something tangible, portable, repeatable. This is the great turning point. Games move from accidental doodles and playful squabbles into actual objects. Game making becomes a craft, and you, leaning against the cool mud wall, realize that every carved line in that plank is just as revolutionary as the first wheel or the first brick. Because while those inventions carried weight, these carved squares carried joy. The Egyptians might not survive endless drought, plagues, or invaders forever, but some part of their laughter, their muttered arguments over rules, their thrill as a pawn moved correctly across squares, would last thousands of years. And for a brief moment, as the craftsman yawns and stretches tired arms, his future lost creation leans against the wall like an afterthought. Not gold, not tombs, not pyramids, no. Just a board game. And somehow, that is what survives. Evening rolls across the land like a slow tide, and with it comes the cooling reprieve that nudges people out of their huts and into the courtyards of the wealthy. Here, the air no longer smells only of bread and sweat. Instead, honeyed wine, roasted ducks, and sweet fig cakes perfume the gathering. Lamps flicker, and servants bustle quietly as wide cushions are arranged. This is no ordinary get-together. Tonight, you've stepped into the royal orbit, where pharaohs and nobles pass hours not with plows and baskets, but with music, stories, and, of course, games. Imagine court scribes leaning in to whisper poems while harp strings hum softly in the background. The clinking of jars of beer blends with chatter, but at the center of everything stands an elaborately carved Senet board, polished gleaming wood with ivory squares that practically glow. This isn't just entertainment anymore. it's spectacle. Because when pharaohs play, they don't simply pass time, they perform politics. Here's your mainstream fact. Senate appears in tomb paintings not just where peasants reside, but in royal murals too. Tutankhamun's tomb alone contained multiple Senate boards of exquisite craftsmanship. This tells you pharaohs didn't just observe. They actively partook, dedicating game equipment as personal treasures for their eternal journey. For them, every token's glide across the board doubled as theater, both against the opponent and in front of the ruling court. You notice one particular scene. A nobleman claps his hands dramatically as his piece leaps forward. Laughter ripples down the table, but watch the pharaoh. He allows himself the barest smile, and then calmly moves his pawn into position. Suddenly, the mood shifts. This isn't simply about winning tonight. It's about showcasing divine cleverness that reaffirms his right to rule. It's like the original office poker night, except the boss is a living god, and bluffing incorrectly might cost you more than face. You probably wouldn't survive that particular hand. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some noble Senate boards also doubled as furniture, functioning as little stools or small cases. That is, their divine game board was also their coffee table. Imagine showing off a PS5 that also serves as your ottoman. Practical, yes, but also hilariously awkward if your guest leans back too hard on history's first gaming console. And court play had another implication. Imitation. When the pharaoh or his officials obsessed over a board, villagers everywhere began shaping their own cheaper versions. This trickle-down effect meant even peasants borrowed scraps of grids into plaster floors just to mimic the elite. It reinforces a simple truth. When you watch your leaders cling to a trend, you're far more likely to play along. Historians still argue whether rulers actually enjoyed these games as much as villagers or whether play was a form of ritual propaganda. A way of publicly showing everyone that the pharaoh brought order, luck, and cosmic victory even to leisure pursuits. Did the pharaoh actually care if he lost a round? Or was every slip conveniently reinterpreted as a divine gesture? Those scholarly debates ripple still. But in this courtyard, set beneath linen awnings fluttering in the Nubian night breeze, you sense both fun and theater intermingling. A noblewoman leans closer to the board, her bracelets tinkling like wind chimes as she hovers before sliding her piece. The whole group chuckles when she smirks with triumph, clearly enjoying the suspense. Play is universal, it sneaks through decorum. Even the gods, perhaps, allow nobles to bend their aloof posture for the delight of a lucky roll. There's comfort in recognizing it. You're seeing yet another timeless truth. No matter the age, no matter how golden the jewelry or heavy the crowns, humans crave downtime. Pharaohs may have ruled the Nile, commanded armies, and constructed monuments that touched the heavens, but still, they sat down, rolled the sticks, groaned or cheered, and passed lazy hours over carved boards with family and friends. And in the music of the harp, the laughter over pawns, and the flicker of lamplight, the royal court suddenly feels less intimidating. You smell roasted honey drifting past. You hear sandals scratching softly on tiled stone. And for a breath of time, Egypt's most powerful are just people leaning over a game, inventing excuses for their moves, caught between pride, superstition, and delight. The palace walls shimmer pale under moonlight, towering as symbols of permanence. Yet somehow you sense the actual heartbeat of Egypt lies here, on tiny boards carved with 30 squares, where painted pawns march clumsily toward victory or loss. The pyramids might dazzle, the temples might endure, but it's hard not to believe that what truly kept these leaders human was the steady rhythm of gameplay under desert stars. The night has settled gently, pouring cool air through the palm trees and filling the courtyards with a hushed excitement that seems oddly disproportionate to what lies on the table. Because what lies there isn't a feast or a scroll or even a divine idol. It's a lattice of 30 small squares, 3 rows of 10, lined so carefully that even now, thousands of years later, people still puzzle over it. This is Senate, the game of passing. And as you lean closer, you realize that in this simple object Egypt achieved something profoundly strange. They turned leisure into both ritual and metaphor for life itself. The game board looks deceptively plain. 30 squares, each the size of a finger's width. Some held markings, symbols like water or fate or shelter. On these neat grids, Small figurines march slowly forward. Sometimes little peg-shaped pawns, sometimes carved forms of geese, jackals, or pyramidal cones. Movements are determined not by dice exactly, but by 4 narrow sticks thrown onto the table. Each stick had one rounded and one flat side, and depending on how they landed, pieces advanced. It's luck meeting calculation. And if that description makes you think of modern-day dice rolls or the chaos of rolling Monopoly doubles, well, congratulations, you've just recognized the continuity of millennia. Mainstream historical fact: Senet is firmly recognized as one of, if not the, world's first documented board games, dating back to around 3100 BCE. Archaeologists have traced its presence from limestone thank yous carved in Old Kingdom tombs to fully gilded aristocratic boards during the New Kingdom. Its sheer persistence shows it wasn't just a fad, it was timeless. But the quirky tidbit? Senet seems to have doubled as a survival guide for eternity. The marked squares weren't just gameplay features like lose a turn. They embodied layers of afterlife symbolism, the chaos of water, the safety of shelter, the blessedness of destiny. Land on the wrong square, trouble. Land on the right, a shortcut to eternal bliss. You might groan at getting sent back 3 squares in today's board games, but imagine believing your slip was the equivalent of stumbling into the dark river of the Duat, stalked by crocodile demons. Exhilarating in its way. And here's the scholarly puzzle, folded like an unsolved riddle. Historians still argue whether we'll ever know the true rules of Senet. No written manual exists, no papyrus scroll that says definitively, Step 1, throw your sticks, Step 2. Instead we have art, fragments, and educated guesses. Some argue it was entirely luck-driven. Others propose strategic blocking, routes of exclusion, or even match-ending checkmate-style moves. What makes it hilarious is how familiar that sounds. Every family still rewrites game rules to fit their house. So in short, Egypt kept the world's longest house rule debate running for 40 centuries. You relax back, watching one player toss the casting sticks, which clatter lightly against the wooden board. The tension in the air is absurd. The pawn lands near a danger square, only barely safe. The group exhales like they've just survived another famine. It seems exaggerated until you remember how invested humans get in symbolic play. Whether it's fantasy football or ancient Senet, the brain interprets small wins like they're monumental. Egypt was no exception. This blend of luck and fate could turn evenings into mini soap operas. Picture a young man glaring at his friend across the torches, sure that Batet is cheating on him through rigged sticks, or a noble complaining his opponent had breathed too hard over the pawns. Petty grievances, small rituals of laughter, and perhaps, when someone lost too badly, whispers that the gods had taken their side for judgment. It's also relatable, it hurts just a little bit. Senet also had a cosmic rhythm. Every pawn symbolized more than just a player. It represented stages of the soul's journey. Birth, chaos, prosperity, difficulty, and final transcendence. Which means, framed in the Egyptian mind, to beat your neighbor in Senet was to show, in miniature, the triumph of your soul over theirs. A tiny victory of eternity, concealed in evening gossip. There were even traditions of women playing Senet, depicted in songs and paintings, as mothers teaching daughters, or lovers flirting under moonlight. And though patriarchal dominance ruled most of Egyptian society, the game board briefly offered a flattened stage where even royalty or priestesses could laugh and countermove, treating fate with equal cheek. You can almost see Cleopatra's distant ancestor smirking as she flicks her pawn forward, enjoying that she's checkmating destiny itself. The landscape beyond is quiet now, only the lap of the Nile and the occasional bark of a dog breaking the calm. Shadows shift across torchlit walls, as if carved gods are leaning slightly forward to see who wins. And though you can't help but chuckle, imagining these eternal beings caring about a clunky roll of the sticks, you also understand why Egyptians believed so deeply. In their minds, every roll was practice. Practice for enduring chaos, for slipping past danger, for reaching eternity safely. And tonight, in this courtyard, you see the truth of an old irony. The pyramids, temples, and colossi of Egypt may have crumbled, But this simple grid of 30 squares has quietly cheered humans across thousands of miles and millennia. Egypt carved eternity not only in stone, but in play. And as the last pawn slides forward, you can't help but feel that Egypt's greatest magic wasn't monuments. It was making even a game feel like destiny. The torches are burning low now, and the last echoes of laughter from the courtyards fade as nobles return to jeweled chambers to dream of gods and fate. You, however, drift away from the luxuries of carved Senate boards and golden pawns and wander back down into the sandy-limbed neighborhoods by the river. Here, shadows are longer, voices more casual, and life somehow simpler. And it's here that leisure takes on another face. Less polished, less gilded, but equally alive. Families gather in front of modest huts after chores are finished. There is no polished cedar table, no ivory sticks with painted markings. Instead, there are pebbles, bones, and scraps of pottery. You watch a group of boys crouched on the ground, tossing sheep knucklebones into the air with astonishing rhythm, laughing when one clatters off course. Their sisters sit huddled together, tracing small circles in the dirt, dropping seeds into them, rearranging patterns like a dry season predecessor to modern Mancala. Here's a mainstream fact. Games with knucklebones or astragali were common across the ancient world. Not just in Egypt, but in Greece, Mesopotamia, and beyond. The Egyptians had their own fondness for these, using goat or sheep bones as dice long before carved wooden cubes appeared. And yes, they'd sometimes paint them, trying to make chance more colorful. The quirky tidbit. Bones weren't the only tools. Everyday children used date stones, those little glossy pits left over from snacks, as gaming pieces. Next time you toss one away, imagine instead it becoming the star token of a championship match in a dusty Egyptian street. There's something funny about it, isn't there? You picture some 7-year-old bragging, "Behold my legendary date seed. Nobody beats it." Universal kid behavior. The energy here is free, breezy, and without the stiff posture of aristocratic gaming. Yet it's no less serious to those playing. Competition ignites quickly, sputtering in playful squabbles. One boy insists the bone lands counted differently. Another accuses him of cheating. The same arguments ripple through your modern board game nights, except here there's no book of rules to appeal to. Just voices, a bit of stubbornness, and a parent stepping in reluctantly to play referee. Historians still argue whether these street games influenced formal ones like Senate, or whether they simply ran parallel. Two rivers of play flowing beside each other, one destined for temples and tombs, the other remaining in the laughter of mudbrick alleys. Was the noble's board simply an upgrade of a child's distraction? Or did both emerge separately, bound only by the universal instinct to game? The line blurs, and perhaps that's the most charming part. As the night deepens, gentle breezes rustle palm fronds overhead, and the clack of bones falling becomes part of the evening soundtrack, mingling with the croak of frogs by the Nile. Grandmothers join in, showing younger players how to flick seeds precisely, claiming strategies passed down over years. To their grandchildren, this might sound like divine wisdom. To you, it sounds suspiciously like the earliest version of, "Trust me, I know how to play this better than you." What you're witnessing is just as timeless as the pyramids, but infinitely homier. Family life infused with ritualized fun. The board game here is no gold-leafed artifact, destined for a tomb. Instead, it's a scattering of pebbles and chatter, a reminder that invention starts not with extravagance, but with boredom, repetition, and a few clever hands. So when you think of the so-called first board games, you can imagine Egypt not just in palaces and temples, but in these nightly games where grit, imagination, and bones tossed into starlight gave structure to evenings. You almost want to pick one up yourself, toss it into the air, and giggle at how quickly you've been pulled into something eternal. And above, the stars burn patiently, as they always have. The same pinpricks of light that once watched over grand courts also watch over goat bones clattering in the dirt. And maybe, just maybe, they're equally entertained by both. The sky now glitters deep indigo, the kind of color that makes you immediately slower, softer, aware of how fragile a flame looks when cushioned by all that starlight. You drift toward the silence of the tombs, carved into cliffs like shelves for eternity. At first it feels eerie, stepping closer to the resting places of nobles and kings, but then you notice something familiar. Paintings along stone walls, frozen scenes of daily life. And there, nestled among harvests, dances, and rituals, are games. Figures hunch over colorful boards, pawns mid-move, arms raised as if in triumph. These aren't idle sketches. No, these are deliberate statements. A declaration that games mattered deeply, so much that the dead wanted them on their walls forever. Tomb art is no casual scrapbook. It's the Instagram highlight reel of Egyptian eternity. To have Senet painted beside one sarcophagus was to declare, "I plan to keep playing forever." Here's your grounded fact. Senet's presence in tombs, like those of Queen Nefertari and Tutankhamun, cements its role not just as a pastime but as a spiritual compass. Egyptians believed tokens crossing those squares weren't just wooden pawns. They were symbolic souls navigating their task of entering paradise. By immortalizing themselves playing, the deceased signaled confidence that they knew the rules of life, death, and what came after. Now, the quirky discovery, archaeologists have even uncovered ghost boards, hand-etched shallow grids carved directly onto tombstones or temple stairs. Were these simply doodles by bored workers chipping figurines into stone while on break? Or were they spiritual emergency boards, ready-to-play surfaces for souls to enjoy in their new, eternal house? Imagine a pharaoh strolling by his own memorial wall, sighing, "Well, I forgot to pack my gold-leaf set, but luckily, the masons gave me this graffiti version." This is where historians come to argue again. Did Egyptians truly believe they played in the afterlife, or was the imagery metaphorical, shorthand for a safe passage? Some scholars insist gameplay was literal, that a soul sat and moved pawns across squares just as living hands once did. Others claim it was symbolic art, akin to depicting servants bringing food. Nobody thought ghost servants had to literally bake bread again. The truth hovers over the hieroglyphs, unsolved and whimsical. You step deeper into a chamber, torchlight licking painted walls. There's Nefertari, elegantly draped, serene at her Senet board. Her face has that unmistakable calm of someone utterly sure she's going to win. Not just the game, but eternity itself. And isn't that just perfect? Human vanity painted onto cosmic stakes. I know how to play the game of life and I will win. Egyptians made no sharp line between the trivial and the divine. It's strangely touching, isn't it? Even faced with death, humans packed their leisure. We can imagine the solemn funerals, grand priests chanting, processions winding across desert roads. But inside the tomb, tucked beside canopic jars and golden masks, is a game board. A whisper that part of the afterlife was reserved for laughter, clever rolls, and patience. The air inside feels especially still, carrying the weight of thousands of years. You lean closer to those wall paintings, running your hand gently across long faded squares, and you feel the message echo in your own bones. Life is fleeting, survival is brutal, but games can travel across mortality. Your torch guttering low, you look back once more. Jackals painted in neat lines, geese waiting in hieroglyphs, and noble hands clutching pawns. Somehow you recognize yourself in those images. Just a person craving one more round, hoping eternity offers not just rest, but replay. And under that thought, the tomb grows warmer, softer, as if even stone walls giggle quietly at the thought of souls moving pawns by starlight, forever. By the time you emerge from the tomb's cool shadows, dawn has returned to the horizon. The Nile gleams with hints of pink and gold, the water moving steadily as though nothing on earth, not pharaohs, not tombs, not even time, can slow it. You walk along its banks, feeling a faint breeze tugging perfumed air from boats docked nearby. Unlike the quiet courtyards or dusty village lanes you've seen before, this place hums with another rhythm altogether. The rhythm of merchants, traders, and caravans moving goods as precious as life itself. And tucked away in their bundles, sometimes hidden between jars of frankincense and rolls of papyrus, were the very games born along these shores. Here's a mainstream fact. Egypt sat at the heart of trade routes that linked Africa, the Near East, and the Mediterranean. Caravans carried not only gold, linen, and grain, but also cultural habits, stories, songs, and yes, objects of play. Archaeologists have uncovered gaming boards and trade ports, their surfaces worn from hands that may have belonged not just to Egyptians but to visitors from Nubia, the Levant, or even distant Aegean islands. Games traveled like gossip, and gossip, as you know, is unstoppable. Picture the scene. A caravan halts in the desert, camels groaning under heaps of resin, turquoise, and salt. The merchants settle by the campfire, sipping watered beer or munching on dried figs. And then, someone pulls out a flat wooden board, pawns rattling in a small pouch. Conversations quiet, playful groans rise, and suddenly the trade network transforms into a game table. Because let's be honest, after weeks crossing endless heat on camelback, you'd need distraction too. The quirky tidbit? In a few cases, archaeologists have uncovered boards actually carved into the flat surfaces of ship planks. Imagine sailors carving out their boredom between hauling nets and steering through shallow Nile channels. These weren't elaborate, just rough-lined grids worn into the wood where dice or knucklebones would roll wildly every time the boat rocked. The world's earliest travel edition board game, if you like. But there's debate here. Historians still argue whether these traveling boards spread Egyptian ideas outward, influencing games like Mesopotamian royal game of UR, or whether Egypt had borrowed similar inspirations in return. Was the Nile the exporter or the importer of gameplay? It's a scholarly chicken or egg quagmire. Either way, the implication is stunning. Rolling a few sticks or stones could leapfrog cultures, settle into foreign customs, and cross desert borders without a passport. You picture it vividly now. A Phoenician trader teaching his Egyptian counterpart a simple shell toss game, while the Egyptian teaches him Senate rules, half correctly, half improvised. A Nubian caravan leader boasts about winning 8 games straight, while a Syrian visitor insists their own version is far superior. This chit-chat is light, almost comedic, yet underneath, it's cultural blending at its most subtle. A pawn sliding forward becomes an invisible handshake that says, "We understand each other." Games also pass time between stalls in Egypt's sprawling marketplaces. Imagine a grain merchant waiting all morning for buyers, fiddling with a travel board drawn on the back of papyrus scraps. A child from another stall spots it, joins in, and before long, the narrow alley echoes not only with haggling but with soft cheers of pretend victories. Markets, you realize, weren't only for goods. They were, just like today, seedbeds for shared culture and casual joy. And then, in evening camps far from home, merchants carried these habits wherever they went. The desert stretched, the moons waxed and waned, and yet pawns still clinked softly against wooden boards. Even the dunes bore witness to games, those faint giggles swallowed quickly by wind, leaving behind nothing visible but carrying the sound through memory. What you see on these trade routes is proof of something profound. Games may have been born of survival, ritual, and courtly drama, but they endured because merchants carried them. Royal palaces could crumble, temples could fall, but a wooden board tucked into a camel's saddle bag that could ripple forward, quietly influencing generations in places Egypt itself would never fully rule. As you rest against a bale of linen and watch merchant boys challenging one another over date pits, the Nile behind them burbling serenely, you feel it keenly. Games aren't confined. They're travelers, stowaways in the pockets of humanity, hidden in bundles of spice and ink. They've never paid customs fees, never bothered with treaties. They leap freely from one culture to the next, disguised as laughter. And you let your eyelids droop, listening to bones and stones clatter across boards. Somewhere, between trade gossip and biting desert wind, you hear history stretching outward along those routes. Invisible pawns of culture, forever sliding square to square. The trade routes extend outward, like veins pulsing from the Nile, and as you follow them into distant horizons, you see the ripple effect. Egypt's games didn't exist in a cultural bubble. They leapt borders, sneaked into rituals of neighbors, and became stitched into the habits of people who lived both close and far. Sitting now on the edge of a Nubian village, you can almost hear the faint clatter of pawns not just in Egyptian hands but in those of trading allies, partners, and rivals. Here's your mainstream fact. Evidence suggests that Egypt's board games, most notably Senet and Mehen, found their way beyond its borders, influencing similar styles played in Nubia and Mesopotamia. Near the 3rd millennium BCE, Mesopotamians were already enjoying the royal game of Uar, suspiciously echoing elements of dice rolls, destiny, and racing pawns across symbolic spaces. While the rules weren't identical, the blending is visible, like discovering two recipes of bread rising differently from the same mixture of grain. The games hint at shared ideas, carried along in caravans of goods and gossip. The quirky tidbit? In some Levantine towns, players etched board games directly into the stone benches of temples and public plazas. That's right, religious courtyards doubled as game arcades. Grooves cut right where solemn prayers were offered. Imagine turning up to your neighborhood church or mosque, only to find tic-tac-toe carved lovingly into the stone pews. Human priorities haven't changed much. Yet historians still argue whether Egypt was the influencer or the influenced. Did Egypt's Senet create a whole dynasty of international grid-based games? Or did traders import foreign concepts back to the Nile, which Egyptians polished into new forms like Mehen? The debates stir on, dusty as the artifacts themselves. Some scholars point to clear Egyptian origins. Others point eastward, claiming external sparks. Like two friends claiming credit for inventing the same meme, the answer may never be anything but both. You step closer to a Nubian household, where families sit outside their reed homes. A young man is leaning over a portable clay board, smooth tokens shuffling under lamplight. His opponent, a woman with bracelets tinkling softly, laughs, blocking his pawn with sly ease. They're playing something that looks like Senet, but not quite. Rules blur, local adaptations emerge, and suddenly it's their game. Egyptian roots may exist, but human creativity localizes quickly. What begins one way in Memphis looks slightly different in Kush. Cultural exchange has always thrived through play. It's simple, portable, and strangely addictive, one of the first universal languages. You don't need to know a word of Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform when both sides understand the thrill of luck and the smugness of winning. Any gesture, rolling bones, moving pawns, becomes instantly recognizable. Suddenly, a Syrian merchant and an Egyptian farmer don't feel so alien after all. Not when they're both grumbling over the same, unfair roll. You imagine caravans halting at desert oases, evening stars shimmering above, and different groups gathered together, bridging silence with shared dice tosses. These aren't the loud, gilded parties of Pharaoh's courts. They're quieter, friendlier connections. Moments where mistrusting strangers turn into companions through a temporary game alliance. Coffee houses in Ottoman Istanbul would do the same thousands of years later. The template was already old by then. There's a poetic irony here. The pharaoh's grand ambassadors might struggle to keep treaties alive, armies might march and falter, but a flat board with carved grooves could do what politics often failed to, create a bond. In that sense, Egypt's board games were like shadows of peace, informal contracts that no one signed but everyone instinctively agreed to. The night deepens as you follow the roads further east toward Babylonian towns. Here too, you find racing games across grids of squares, dice rolls echoing cries of luck, and pawns scattering like stars across boards. Some are wooden, some clay, a few etched crudely onto rock. Their elegance or lack thereof doesn't matter. The shared idea is immortal. Out here, the Egyptian seed has been absorbed, adapted, and planted in new soil. And you realize the profound continuity. Games always move faster than monuments. Temples collapse, pyramids crumble, stonework erodes. But laughter, pawns, and rules, those glide across borders more smoothly than silk. Tonight, in Nubia, Mesopotamia, and beyond, tiny squares and tokens light up lives just as they did back in the Nile's heartland. If pyramids were Egypt's proclamation of their power to the heavens, then Senet and its neighbors were their whispers of joy passed secretly sideways to neighbors. And tonight, you sit still, listening to those whispers flutter like dice across the sand, the echoes traveling as seamlessly as wind. The desert wind carries you onward, but instead of laughter or trade chatter, you start to hear another kind of sound. Quiet debates layered with curiosity. voices colliding over fragments of wood and stone. Imagine a group of modern scholars bent over display cases in a museum, their brows furrowed, arguing in hushed tones. "Clearly this piece shows house rules," says one. "No, it's spiritual only," another retorts. That buzzing argument threads across centuries because when it comes to Egyptian board games, no one can quite agree on how they were really played. Here's your mainstream fact. No complete written rulebook for Senate survives. Not one papyrus scroll explains definitively how you were supposed to toss sticks or move pawns. Instead, everything we know comes from carved boards found in graves, faint hieroglyphic inscriptions, and painted murals. So scholars patchwork everything together. Diagrams here, art there, wild conjecture everywhere. It's like trying to reconstruct Monopoly only from a picture of the box lid and an instruction sheet missing half its pages. Now for the quirky tidbit. In the 20th century, a few dedicated Egyptologists set up literal tournaments of reconstructed Senate, testing hypothesized rules with colleagues. They used faithful wooden reproductions and spent evenings rolling sticks, moving pawns with solemnity. And here's the kicker, they still couldn't agree afterward which version was right. Imagine going through the effort only to end with, "Well, maybe we all cheated." Currently, multiple reconstruction models exist. Some scholars see it as a race game, where pieces must zigzag across squares toward the end. Others propose it was about blocking opponents, closer to backgammon, perhaps. Still others argue that landing on certain square symbols, like the House of Waters, included penalties or restarts. Historians still argue fiercely whether these interpretations are mutually exclusive or whether Egyptians themselves played multiple variants, just like modern families do with Uno. The joy of these academic scuffles? They reveal how alive the game still feels. The fact that respectable professionals scratch their heads and mutter about pawns shows you just how much life resists being pinned down. You almost picture the spirits of Egyptians laughing in their tombs. "You thought we'd leave you a manual? No, half the fun is watching you guess." Another layer complicating things. Some boards aren't identical. 30 squares is the consistent outline, but their markings differ wildly. Some include only a few decorated squares of significance. Others show elaborate inscriptions, perhaps hinting at local house rules, which suggests that the concept of canon rules might have been alien to Egyptians altogether. For them, it was enough to carve a grid and move pawns. You and your friends could agree the rest. If that sounds familiar, it's because even now, your family probably plays Monopoly differently from your neighbor's family down the street. Infinity loop complete. Inside museum cases, those boards whisper. Golden inlays shimmer. Ivory pawns stare blankly. Scholars crane their necks, debating probability, chance, and strategy. Unaware they're basically repeating the same conversations Egyptian families had thousands of years ago. The arguments might be fancier today, stuffed with terminology and footnotes, but deep down, they're still fighting over what counts as a legal move. There's something genuinely cozy in that realization. Past and present don't drift apart as much as we think. The same restless need to interpret, complain, and adjust rules binds us to those long-gone players. And for all the pyramids and sphinxes, nothing feels more human than a game dispute. So as you lean against the glass of an imaginary museum case, peering down at a carved Senate board shimmering under white lights, you find it warming to realize that history's silence doesn't erase joy. The boards might never tell their secret fully. Archaeologists might never agree. But each guess, each reconstruction, is just another move in the eternal game. And as that thought settles, you hear faint laughter carried from some unseen table millennia away. Egyptians chuckling, eternally smug, as scholars today lose to ghost opponents in imaginary matches. The desert winds soften, and you wander back through the timeless glow of lamplight, hearing faint echoes of dice, or rather stick tosses, clattering faintly against boards. But tonight, there's a different undercurrent moving beneath the laughter. Fortune-telling, hopeful guesses, and the subtle weight of mystery. Because in Egypt, games weren't always just games. They overlapped with divination, blurring entertainment and fate until it was impossible to separate one from the other. Here's your mainstream fact. In Egyptian culture, methods of divination often involved randomness. casting lots, interpreting omens, tossing bones or sticks, and Senate's mechanics perfectly lent themselves to this. To most, throwing forecasting sticks with their flat and rounded sides was a fair way to determine movement. To others, it was a message straight from higher powers. A particularly bad throw could mean more than losing a pawn. It might forecast sickness or misfortune. A particularly good throw? Well, perhaps Batet or Ra himself was smiling at you. Now here comes the quirky tidbit. Some Egyptians used sheep scapula bones, polished into smooth little rectangles, not only for gaming but also for divination. Think of them as multipurpose dice. One evening, you'd cast them to see who won a casual game. The next, you'd hand them to a priest, who would interpret whether your goat herd was doomed. Efficiency at its finest. It's like having a deck of cards that doubles as both poker night fun and your personal astrological chart. Historians still argue whether Senate itself ever became an official divination tool or whether it was simply fortune adjacent. Some insist it was purely symbolic of the afterlife, a ritual rehearsal for when your soul faced Osiris. Others suggest ordinary Egyptians casually read omens from the rolls. Was it destiny or just probability? The scholarly skirmish continues, with everyone equally unsure whether they're deciphering religion or catching echoes of an ancient board night brawl. Picture yourself sitting cross-legged by a simple clay board. Tokens move silently across chalk dust lines. Every roll of sticks feels heavier, like flipping tarot cards. For sticks flat, your friend grins smugly, telling you Ra blesses him today. Land on the House of Waters square? You groan. Others tease you, claiming a bad omen lurks nearby. And though you chuckle, a tiny part of your heart skips. You want to believe games whisper truths from the cosmos too. This little overlap shows just how thin the border was between ritual and recreation. Egyptians rarely separated the sacred from the everyday. They prayed before meals, painted gods on furniture, and, apparently, believed divine nudges guided their pawns. To them, destiny wasn't written only in stars and papyrus, it was written in dice rolls too. There's something oddly soothing about that idea. You imagine modern parallels. Pulling a bad Jenga block and groaning that the universe is out to get you, or claiming a lucky shuffle proves today was meant to be your day. Ancient Egypt simply believed those sentiments more earnestly. A lucky throw could mean real safety for your soul. An unlucky one might send you murmuring prayers of correction. And as the evening winds blow across the Nile, scattering incense smoke into the wide blue night, you realize how games gave Egyptians not only laughter and distraction but also subtle hope. When famine loomed, when floods misbehaved, when diseases simmered in heat, perhaps tossing sticks across squares offered comfort. The feeling that fate could turn suddenly, offering a victory in both games and life. Just as sands smooth sharp stones over centuries, the game smoothed harsh realities with one roll at a time. Pawns became luck, luck became prayer, and prayer became resilience. The horizon darkens. You hear laughter from another cluster of villagers nearby, followed by groans at a poor roll. For a moment, the deep croak of a bullfrog mixes with their superstitious exclamations. And you realize fate, for humans, is rarely only in temples. It lives in that small shake of chance, in that hopeful belief that maybe the sticks will fall flat side up just for you. The nights are long along the Nile. By this point, you've walked through palaces, workshops, bustling markets, and even the silence of tombs, tracing the way games stitched themselves into different layers of Egyptian life. Yet now, as the lamps burn lower and the streets of the village quiet, you stumble across a softer, gentler context. The games of women, children, and whole families huddled together. Because contrary to the statues and gold-leafed boards found in temples, play wasn't just for priests or kings. It rippled through courtyards and kitchens, echoing in sang-songs and bedtime rituals. Here's your mainstream fact. Depictions of Senate and casual games appear not only in the company of men or nobles, but also women and children. Archaeological evidence, including smaller travel-size boards and painted household walls, suggests that gaming crossed genders and ages. It wasn't confined to dusty officials. It touched every tier of society. Now add your quirky tidbit. Remnants of ivory gaming pieces shaped like ducks, hippos, and even tiny cats have been unearthed, almost like ancient cartoon characters, fun and oddly playful. Scholars suspect these weren't for formal eternal afterlife rounds, but for children who wanted to stomp their tokens across squares with a smile. Nothing like a duck-shaped pawn mocking you after a bad roll. But was play fully egalitarian? Historians still argue on this point. Some push the idea that children and women only staged simple diversions parallel to men's serious gaming. Others maintain that everyone, from a father just home from the fields to his daughter and grandmother, might gather into the same circle, pawns scattered among many hands. Once again, no single answer holds. The fragments allow us to imagine both solemn divisions and joyful communal scenes. Now you see it unfold before you. A household gathering after chores, stools pulled close, date jars passed along, and laughter spilling into warm starlight. Children squat directly on packed earth, pebbles rattling as they invent rules nobody else remembers. Their mother stretches out her legs, flicking a pawn forward, smiling faintly when she beats her son. The father chuckles at her coy triumph, pretending to sulk, only to suddenly roll perfectly and leapfrog her piece back. The kids explode in shrieks of delight. The games of families feel recognizable. The arguments about fairness belong as much to 7-year-olds today as to those painted children once buried in Egypt's sands. There's that same exasperating sibling energy. You cheated. No, you're just losing. Only here, in 1500 BCE, their backdrop is a palm tree courtyard lit by oil lamps. Even lullabies bore resemblance to games. Some mothers recited rhythmic chants that accompanied tossing pebbles or clapping stones, turning bedtime into a playful ritual. Imagine a mix between hopscotch rhymes and whispered prayers. In this sense, play wasn't something tacked onto the end of a day. It was stitched into family bonding, bedtime calm, and even childhood learning. You notice the parallels, how games doubled as quiet teaching tools, seeding patience during a long round, teaching counting through pawn movements, sharpening memory through repeated chants. Look closely. What seems like carefree distraction is already education. Children of Egypt learned mathematics from chores, religion from rituals, and strategy from pawns slid across a board. Soothing, too, is the recognition that leisure belonged to everybody. Not just kings counting victories beside gold goblets, not just scribes muttering rules by candlelight, but ordinary people. Mothers, daughters, sons, old grandmothers coaxing children to sleep. Their knucklebones and pawns weren't gilded artifacts, but pebbles shaped by the river's flow. And as you stand quietly nearby, you hear how universal the laughter sounded, how steady the rhythm of play was across every generation. Perhaps that's why those small ivory ducks mattered as much as golden boards. The polished trinkets didn't belong to pharaohs. They belonged to some forgotten child, still immortal in miniature. They remind you that history isn't built only on monuments, but also on bedtime games tucked into the pauses of survival. And as the household winds down, kids yawning wide, parents nudging them toward mats, the pawns remain scattered in the dust, glowing faint beneath the moonlight. Century after century, they wait patiently there, tiny anchors of joy, until finally archaeologists stumble onto them, whispering, yes, even families thousands of years ago played before sleep. The stillness of late night hangs over the Nile, broken only by the rhythmic humming of frogs and the occasional splash of a fish in the current. The lamps are nearly out in the villages, and the great courts of pharaohs echo with silence. Yet around you there lingers a haunting awareness. These games, so alive in workshops, waterways, and family courtyards, would not last forever. Like so many aspects of Egyptian life, they too had a twilight. Here's your mainstream fact. By the late period of Egyptian history, around the first millennium BCE, Senet and Mehen gradually faded from the cultural foreground. The reasons are unclear, but imported games from nearby cultures and evolving social customs likely displaced the older traditions. By the time of the Greco-Roman period, the once ubiquitous Senet board had largely vanished from everyday life. A pastime that had endured for nearly 2,000 years slowly dimmed, leaving only fragments for archaeologists to piece together. But here's the curious tidbit. Some surviving boards from this later era show half-finished carvings, as if the craftsman never completed them, or as if buyers lost interest before they were delivered. A board game in the most literal sense. They sit like frozen mid-sentences, silent epitaphs to a hobby slipping out of fashion. You can almost imagine a weary artisan muttering, "Nobody plays this anymore," before abandoning the project and walking away. Historians still argue why this happened. Did Egyptians truly lose interest, swept up in Greek imports like knucklebones and dice games? Or did Senet transform fully into a symbolic afterlife ritual, stripped of its casual appeal, leaving it no longer interactive but merely decorative? Did villagers really stop playing? Or were archaeologists simply too unlucky to find more? It's a quiet academic tug of war, reflecting that the line between memory and extinction is hazy. You squat by the riverbank, picturing Egyptians of the late eras watching foreigners arrive with new goods, foreign ideas, and novel toys. Perhaps they were dazzled by simpler, luck-driven dice or quick games needing less ritual weight. Or maybe it was change for change's sake, the way people today abandon one viral trend for another. A people who had mastered eternity still weren't immune to boredom. The twilight of pyramid play did not arrive abruptly, like the shutting of a door. It slipped in gradually, one household abandoning Senet for something quicker, one noble preferring Greek dice contests over old ritual squares. And layer by layer, the shared cultural heartbeat of 3 rows of 10 squares was replaced by others. Still, the memory persisted. Senet remained inscribed on tomb walls long after the living abandoned it as leisure. It survived in religious iconography, if not in casual laughter, which might actually reveal something poignant, that Egyptians couldn't completely let go. Even if they didn't roll sticks on a Tuesday night anymore, the board still mattered symbolically, enough to place in eternity. And maybe, just maybe, the fading of play had its comfort too. For when something migrates out of ordinary life and into quiet memory, it can rest, preserved. No longer jostled in the markets or scuffed by children's fingers, Senet became the game of the dead, safe in silence until archaeologists woke it centuries later. As you look up, the stars scatter across the black sky, fading slightly under the first paleness of dawn. Around you, the games are restless in the sand, half-forgotten pawns, broken pottery with scratches that once marked scores. The laughter is gone, but the echo remains, folding into the quiet. Sometimes, a game doesn't need to stay played in every courtyard forever. Sometimes it needs only to survive in memory, tucked patiently into tombs, where one day the world will rediscover it and remember that for thousands of nights, it was joy. And so the twilight falls, not with sorrow, but with inevitability. Egypt turns its face to new amusements, new influences, new distractions. But beneath it all, the boards stay buried, whispering calmly, like old friends waiting for you to uncover them again. Morning comes again, soft and golden, the kind that paints the Nile in streaks of honey. By now you've strolled through bustling workshops, royal courts heavy with perfume, sandy courtyards where children tossed bones, and quiet tombs where pawns still sit in painted squares. You've seen laughter, divination, rivalry, and mystery surrounding Egypt's first board games. And as the birds will overhead and the river keeps flowing, you start to see how these games, fragile and fleeting as they seemed, carried echoes far beyond their sandy birthplace. Here's your mainstream fact. The structure of Egyptian race games like Senet shares striking similarities with later classics, Greek patia, Roman tabula, and even medieval backgammon. The idea of pawns crossing a field, dodging hazards, aiming for safe passage. It's a formula so effective it practically wrote the DNA of gaming history. Without Egypt sketching 3 long rows of 10 squares, your kitchen's checkerboard or the global chessboard might look completely different today. The quirky twist? In the 20th century, Senet boards were occasionally included in games museum exhibits right beside modern favorites like Monopoly and Scrabble. The placement was deliberate, to show visitors how ancient practices of play continued to shape family tables in the present. Of course, this also created hilarious moments when kids would wander through, stare at Senet's mysterious 30 squares, and promptly say, "That looks boring." Somewhere, an Egyptian scribe winced in the afterlife. Historians still argue over how direct the lineage is. Was backgammon a true descendant, or did it just inherit structural DNA? Did Senet echo into India's chaturanga, chess's ancestor? Or did that family tree branch independently? Scholars circle the debate endlessly, but the resonance is undeniable. Humanity loves grids, tokens, chance, competition. Somewhere between the desert's pawns and your family's living room, threads connect. You close your eyes, imagining what an Egyptian time traveler would think wandering into a modern home. There we are, sprawled on cozy sofas, intently staring at glowing rectangles on which pixelated pieces scoot across digital boards. The mechanics may look different, but the obsession feels the same. An eternal human instinct to pass the hours, to laugh, to compete gently, and sometimes to read fate in the randomness of roles. It's humbling, really. The pyramids stand vast, but their direct influence on your life is indirect, monumental, yes, but removed. Yet these boards, these pawns, these little sticks thrown onto mats, they live on every time you shuffle cards, roll dice, or argue with a sibling about an over-strict rule. In Egypt, centuries before you were born, people were doing the exact same thing. Complaining, inventing excuses, delighting in lucky breaks. Nothing has changed. Rest easy in that thought, that history isn't only lofty temples and granite colossi. History also nestles quietly between fingers pressing pawns forward, breaths held as dice fall, and laughter rolling out under torchlight. Egypt's first board games have not ended. They slipped into twilight, yes, but they've reincarnated endlessly in your dominoes, your chessboards, your late-night card matches that stretch too long into morning. And as you feel the heat rise off the desert again, the sun bouncing playfully off the water, you take comfort in realizing play is immortal. Pyramids may erode, kingdoms may fragment, but people will always find reasons to scratch lines in the dust and slide stones forward. That's Egypt's quietest gift. A passion for play so strong it traveled across millennia and still sleeps in your own hands. Now the river flows slower in your mind, its ripples stretching gently under the weight of sunlight. You feel the warmth fade, softened by a breeze that seems to carry only calm, as if every sound has been muffled by distance. Imagine yourself watching one last board on the sand, pawns resting, dice still, a game paused midway with no need to finish. It doesn't matter who wins now, only that the game happened, that laughter filled the evening air once upon a time. Let your breathing slow to match the current of the Nile, steady and endless, never rushing and never stopping. Picture sand dunes beyond the river's edge, their shapes like timeless waves folding into each other, and the sky above deepening into a pool of gold. Somewhere out there, in forgotten tombs and buried courtyards, old boards wait silently. They will never speak again, but they don't need to, the echoes remain enough. And you too have been part of this cycle tonight, watching the Egyptians invent joy in the simplest ways, taking fragments from their world and turning them into stories, images, gentle sounds. Feel the weight lift from your shoulders as you realize that even history, with all its monuments and mysteries, eventually shrinks down to the same simple things. The comfort of laughter, the warmth of company, the quiet amusement of play. The pawns rest, the squares fade, and the night answers with silence. You can let yourself rest too, knowing that time is broader than you, that all the worries of your day are no more fixed than a throw of ancient dice. Close your eyes, drift as softly as the Nile at dusk, and carry with you only calm.